A woman who nurtures life in the shadows while the world tramples her. Her existence is woven with symbols of winter botany that the world dismisses as weeds. Like the winter lily she tends, she blooms only in the harshest cold, her worth invisible until the kingdom is dying. The veil tore. The court gasped, and Lyra of Oakhaven learned what it meant to be thrown away by a king. Winter howled through the great hall, dragging snow across 1,000 frozen candles. Lyra stood in ceremonial white, her silver scar hidden beneath silk, her chin unbowed. The court watched. The Alpha King rose. Kaelin's voice cut the hall like a blade across stone. A blemish on the sacred altar. He tore the veil from her head. White hair spilled down her shoulders like falling petals. Gasps rippled across the marble. Cast her out. Something broke inside her so quietly no one heard. Yet Lyra did not weep. She did not kneel. She turned and she walked. Past the lords, past the torches, past the king, whose eyes would haunt her for years. The great doors slammed shut behind her. The blizzard swallowed her whole. Which country are you listening from? Please comment below. I'd love to know how far this story reaches. Before the rejection, before the blizzard, before the tearing of the veil, there had been a girl who lived in the margins of the palace. A girl whose name was spoken only when something needed to be fetched, healed, or blamed. A girl whose footsteps made no sound on the marble floors because the marble floors were not meant for her. Lyra had been 17 when the palace first took her in, 14 when they had first noticed her white hair and silver scar in the market square of a village she no longer remembered. The old palace steward, a man with kindness carved into the lines of his weary face, had plucked her from the crowd and brought her to the kitchens, then to the gardens, then to the infirmary, where her hands found a calling the court refused to name. They called her the white girl, the marked one, the herb scrubber, never Lyra, never once her own name. In the years that followed, she learned the rhythm of invisibility. She rose before the sun to water the royal gardens. Her breath misting over beds of sage and lavender, she knelt in the frost-laced earth and whispered to the roots, and the roots whispered back in a language only she could hear. She brewed tonics in the infirmary for coughing guards and feverish scullery maids. She pressed poultices of comfrey onto the burned hands of the kitchen boys. She set broken fingers for the laundry women. She saved lives in silence, and the silence was the price she paid to keep living. The court physicians took her remedies and stamped them with their own seals. The cures she labored over at midnight were presented to the king at dawn by men who had never once touched a living herb. She watched them bow and accept gold for work that had left calluses on her fingers. She said nothing. She was told again and again by the older maids and the stern-eyed matrons that silence was her shield, that a girl with a silver scar and moon-white hair had no right to a name, much less a grievance. She believed them for a long time. She folded herself smaller each year until she could slip through the servants' corridors without being seen, until she could deliver medicine to a dying lord without any record of her presence, until the palace came to rely on a ghost it refused to acknowledge. She kept a small room above the stables, with a window that opened onto the herb garden. At night she would lie on her narrow cot and listen to the wind move through the rosemary, and she would tell herself she was lucky. Lucky to have a roof, lucky to have work. Lucky the court had not yet decided her scar was a bad omen worth burning. She remembered, sometimes, that her mother had once been burned for less. But she pushed that memory down. She pushed it beneath the floorboards of her mind, and she weighted it with the names of herbs. Valerian for sleep, willow bark for pain, yarrow for bleeding, chamomile for a child who could not stop crying. She survived by becoming a walking apothecary, a living index of every green thing that could save a life or soothe a wound. She survived by giving and giving and giving and never asking for anything in return. The other servants were not cruel to her. Most were simply afraid. They would take her remedies and thank her in whispers. They would leave bread outside her door when winter came, but they would not sit beside her in the dining hall. They would not speak her name aloud where the lords could hear. Kindness in Oakhaven was a dangerous currency, and Lyra had long since stopped expecting it. There were moments, though, small moments she collected like pressed flowers between the pages of her days. A child of the chambermaid, no older than 6, who once grabbed her hand and called her the flower lady. A blind stable hand who always said good morning to her because his ears knew her footsteps better than any eyes. The old steward who had first brought her to the palace, who still left a candle burning in the hallway whenever she worked late. These were her anchors. These were the reasons she did not run. And then there were the herbs. The herbs loved her. She did not know how else to describe it. When she walked through the royal gardens, the stems leaned toward her. When she brewed a tonic, the water seemed to know what she needed before her hands did. In the deepest part of herself, a part she never spoke of, she suspected she was made of something different than the people around her. Something older, something the court would call cursed if it ever learned the truth. She kept that suspicion buried too, beside her mother's memory, beside her name. The night before the winter solstice ceremony, an elderly woman came to her room. A servant Lyra had healed a year before, who had since risen to the rank of underkeeper of the royal linens. The woman's eyes were wet. She pressed a small bundle into Lyra's hands and whispered that the king's council had summoned her, that she was to be presented at the ceremony, that the old steward had pushed her name forward against the wishes of the high chancellor because he believed she deserved a chance to be seen. Lyra stared at the bundle of white ceremonial cloth. Her hands trembled. For the first time in 10 years, something inside her dared to hope. Perhaps she thought the court would finally see her. Perhaps the king would recognize the worth in her silent hands. Perhaps her mother's whispered promise, the one she had spent a lifetime burying, was finally coming true. She did not yet know that hope in Oakhaven was the cruelest medicine of all. The blizzard had no mercy for the discarded. Lyra stumbled through snow that rose to her knees, the torn ceremonial dress clinging to her skin like a second wound. The palace gates were already lost behind her, swallowed by a wall of white. The wind screamed with a voice that sounded almost human, almost angry, almost grieving on her behalf. She did not scream back. She had no voice left to give. Her feet bled. The ceremonial slippers had been made for marble floors, not frozen earth, and they had torn open within the first hour. Each step left a petal of red in the snow behind her, a trail of small crimson flowers blooming in the wake of a woman the court had declared a curse. Her hair now uncovered, whipped around her face in ribbons of white. Her breath came in shallow clouds. Her body was shutting down piece by piece, and somewhere in the rational part of her mind, she understood that she was dying. She did not know how long she walked. Time had unraveled. The world was only wind, only cold. Only the terrible silence inside her chest where her heart refused to stop beating. She thought of her mother. She thought of the old steward. She thought of the small bundle of white ceremonial cloth and the way she had let herself hope. Her throat burned. Her eyes stung. But she did not cry. She had learned long ago that tears froze on the face and wounded the skin beneath. She fell. She rose. She fell again. The third time, she did not rise. She lay on her side in a drift of snow, her cheek pressed to the frozen ground, her eyelids heavy with frost. The wind slackened for a moment, as if the storm itself was pausing to watch her die. And in that terrible quiet, Lyra opened her eyes one last time, certain she would close them forever. That was when she saw it. A thread of soft silver light curling through the snow, winding between her fingers like the stem of a sleeping plant. She blinked. The light did not vanish. It pulsed, faint, patient, alive. She turned her head. The light led away from her, a delicate vein of silver drifting through the drifts, disappearing between the roots of a great pine tree not 20 paces away. She thought she was dreaming. She thought the cold had taken her mind, but something inside her, something deeper than thought, recognized that glow, the herb scrubber part of her, the midnight brewer part of her, the girl who whispered to Rosemary and was answered, stirred from a long sleep. She knew that color. She had seen it before in dreams she had never dared to name. She had seen it once as a child, in the palm of her mother's hand, the night before the pyre. Her fingers trembled. She reached toward the thread of silver. The moment her skin touched it, the world changed. The forest came alive. The pine trees were no longer dark shapes in a white void. They were pillars of quiet green fire, their roots glowing like rivers beneath the earth. The snow was no longer featureless. Beneath its surface, she could see a lattice of sleeping seeds, each one a tiny ember of gold. The trunks of older trees pulsed with a slow, steady light the color of honey. A patch of moss on a stone to her left shimmered with a pale blue radiance she somehow understood without being told. Healing, warmth, breath, life. She gasped. The gasp tore through her. Her lungs filled not just with air but with something deeper, something that tasted of moonlight and old earth. A whisper rose from the ground beneath her. Rise? The word had no sound. It bloomed in her chest like a flower opening at dawn, and with it came another word, softer, closer, spoken in a voice she almost remembered. Daughter? She obeyed. She did not know how. Her body, which moments before had been dying, pushed itself up from the snow. Her torn feet found strength. The silver thread guided her, winding between the glowing trees, leading her to a hollow beneath the pine where the snow had not reached. Inside the hollow grew a small cluster of dark green leaves with silver edges. They glowed faintly, steadily, patiently, She knew them. She had never seen them in life, only in the yellowed drawings of a tattered herbal her mother had once hidden beneath her pillow. Frost silver, a plant the court had declared extinct a century ago. She fell to her knees before the cluster. Her hands trembled as she reached for the leaves. But before she could pluck them, the leaves seemed to reach for her. One detached itself of its own accord and drifted into her palm, light as breath. Another followed, then another. She did not take them, they gave themselves. She pressed them to her mouth. The moment the taste touched her tongue, warmth flooded through her body. Her feet stopped bleeding. Her lungs stopped burning. The frost on her lashes melted into tears at last, and she wept. There on her knees beneath the great pine, wept for her mother, wept for the girl who had hoped, wept for the 10 silent years of a life half-lived. When her weeping ended, she looked around at the glowing forest with new eyes. The silver thread had not vanished. It now circled her wrist like a bracelet of soft light, and then extended onward deeper into the woods toward a ridge where a small stone cottage stood half buried in snow. Abandoned. Waiting. Calling. She understood then what the court had tried to kill in her. What her mother had whispered on the pyre, what the silver scar on her collarbone had always meant. Her gift had not been given to her in the blizzard. It had only been woken. And now, it would no longer sleep. The cottage on the ridge had been empty for decades. But the moment Lyra crossed its threshold, she understood it had been waiting for her. Dust blanketed the hearth, a cracked bowl sat on the table. A dried bouquet of lavender, impossibly still fragrant, hung from a wooden beam. She stepped inside, and the door closed behind her of its own accord, as though the cottage itself had exhaled in relief. She built a fire with hands that no longer trembled. She boiled snow for tea. She wrapped her torn feet in strips of linen she found folded neatly in an old chest. And when at last she lay down on the narrow bed in the corner, the fire crackling softly before her, she closed her eyes and let the memory come. The memory she had buried for 16 years. The memory she could no longer outrun. She had been 7 years old. Her mother had been 31. They had lived in a village at the edge of the northern pine woods, in a house with a slanted roof and a garden that grew impossible things, roses in winter, mint in drought. A pear tree that bore fruit 3 times a year. Her mother had laughed often and sung while she worked. Her mother had hair the color of moonlit snow and a silver scar on her collarbone shaped exactly like her daughter's. Her mother had been a moonbound healer, though Lyra had not known those words then. She only knew that her mother was beloved. That villagers came from miles around when their children coughed through the night. That travelers with wounds festering beyond repair would arrive at their door at dusk and leave at dawn walking upright. She knew her mother gave freely. That payment was never asked for. That the lavender by the gate was always the first to bloom and the last to die. Then the rider came. A royal messenger, his horse frothing at the mouth, his cloak heavy with the crest of the young prince. The king's son was dying of a fever no physician could break. The court had heard, through whispers and desperate prayers, of a white-haired woman in the pines who healed what could not be healed. Her mother had hesitated. Lyra remembered the hesitation. She remembered her mother kneeling before her, pressing a kiss to her forehead, and whispering words a 7-year-old could not yet understand. If I do not return, remember that we are older than their fear. Remember the silver light. Remember that your voice will bloom in winter. Her mother had gone. She had saved the prince. She had returned 3 days later with hollow eyes and trembling hands, and she had burned every herb in the garden. Lyra had not understood. Not then. She had watched her mother tear the lavender from its stems. She had watched her mother bury the herbal beneath the floorboards. She had watched her mother weep for the first time in her life and say, over and over, they saw too much. They had come at dawn, not the prince, not the king, the high chancellor. A man with a long black cloak and a voice like cold iron. He had brought soldiers. He had brought a sealed royal decree. He had brought a pyre already built in the village square. They accused her mother of witchcraft, of corrupting the prince with cursed magic, of bearing the mark of demons on her collarbone. The villagers, the same villagers whose children her mother had nursed through fevers, whose wounds her mother had stitched, whose hunger her mother had fed, stood in silence. No one spoke. No one defended her. Fear had a louder voice than gratitude, and the chancellor had come with fire. They made Lyra watch. A soldier had held her small shoulders, not cruelly, almost tenderly. As if apologizing with his grip, her mother had been tied to a post of green pine that refused to burn at first, the flames guttering low around her ankles until the chancellor had poured oil, and a new fire had roared upward. Her mother had not screamed. She had looked across the square. through the smoke and found her daughter's eyes. And she had mouthed 3 words. Your voice, winter. And then she had closed her eyes, and then the smoke had taken her. Lyra had stopped speaking for 2 years. She had wandered. A traveling merchant had found her in a ditch and left her at a monastery. The monks had kept her quietly, fed her quietly, and when she was 14, they had sent her south with a letter of recommendation to the palace at Oakhaven. The old steward had received her. She had never spoken of her mother. She had never spoken of the pyre. She had buried the memory so deeply she sometimes forgot she had once had a mother at all. Until tonight, until the silver thread, until the frost silver leaf. Lyra opened her eyes in the cottage on the ridge. The fire had burned low, her cheeks were wet. She sat up slowly, and she looked at her silver scar, and she understood that every lie the court had told her was a lie her mother had died to disprove. She pressed her palm to the scar. It was warm. It was awake. She made a vow there in the firelit dark she would never heal a royal again. Not a king, not a queen, not a lord who had watched her walk into the blizzard without lifting a hand. Let them rot in their marble halls. Let their fevers burn them hollow. She would live here, in this cottage, with the herbs that loved her, and she would finally, at last, be free. Then she turned her face to the window, and on the horizon, far beyond the pines, she saw a thread of dark smoke rising from the direction of the palace. Not the smoke of a pyre. The smoke of something far, far worse. The plague arrived without footsteps. It came as a whisper in the lungs of a kitchen boy who had been laughing the night before. It came as a cough in the throat of a stable master who had just saddled the king's horse at dawn. By the 3rd morning of the new year, 7 servants lay pale on their cots, exhaling small clouds of silver mist that drifted from their lips like the ghosts of unspoken words. By the 7th morning, the number was 40. The court physicians, men of high degrees and higher opinions, gathered in the infirmary with stern faces and useless hands. They bled the afflicted, they burned incense, they forced bitter draughts down swollen throats. The sick only grew sicker. The silver mist thickened around their mouths with each failed remedy, as though the plague itself mocked the medicine of men who had never knelt in a garden. They called it the white breath. No one knew who named it first. Perhaps it named itself. Alpha King Kalen stood at the window of his war chamber and watched the smoke rise from the infirmary chimneys, smoke that carried the scent of burning linen stripped from bodies that no longer needed them. His jaw was set. His hands behind his back were clenched so tightly his knuckles had gone pale. He had ruled Oakhaven for 6 years. He had fought 2 border wars. He had survived 3 assassination attempts. He had never felt, until this morning, the cold particular fear of a king who cannot protect his own household. His second-in-command, a warrior named Doran, who had stood at his side since boyhood, coughed in the corridor outside the chamber. Kalen heard it. He closed his eyes. The High Chancellor entered without knocking. A tall man of narrow shoulders and a smile that never reached his eyes. He bowed only as much as protocol required. His black cloak trailed behind him like a spilled inkwell. The sickness spreads. Your Majesty, the Chancellor, said, 47 now, 2 of the Royal Guard, a handmaid of the late Queen. Your second-in-command has developed the first symptoms within the hour. Kalen did not turn from the window. Recommendations. The Chancellor paused with the patience of a man who had rehearsed his answer. We must seal the lower quarters, burn the afflicted cottages, forbid the servants from entering the royal wing. The sickness comes from the low blood. Your Majesty, from those who labor in dirt and darkness. It will not climb the marble stairs if we close the marble doors. Kalen turned at last. His eyes, the color of winter storms, settled on the Chancellor with a weight that had made lesser men flinch. The Chancellor did not flinch. He had. Kalen noted with a flicker of unease, not flinched in many years. And my warriors, Kalen said, are they low blood? They have walked among the low, the Chancellor said smoothly. Proximity breeds contamination. We must be firm. We must be swift. The nobles are watching, Your Majesty. Weakness now will cost you the northern lords within a fortnight. Kalen said nothing. He walked past the Chancellor out of the war chamber, down the long corridor lined with banners. He did not announce himself. He descended the servants' stair, a passage he had not used since childhood, its walls narrower than he remembered, its stones colder. He followed the sound of coughing. He followed the silver mist. The lower infirmary was a place he had never entered. The straw mattresses were packed close together. The air was thick with the smell of sickness and burning sage. A matron looked up, saw him, and dropped the cloth she was holding. She fell to her knees. A dozen others did the same. Kellen did not notice them. His eyes had found the small figure on the mattress nearest the door. A child? perhaps 8 years old. Her hair was dark and damp with sweat. Her small chest rose and fell with visible effort. Her lips were tinged with silver. A wooden carving of a horse lay beside her on the blanket. Forgotten, her small fingers no longer strong enough to hold it. He knew her. He had not known that he knew her, but he remembered now seeing her in the courtyard last summer, chasing a goose, her laughter ringing against the stone walls. He remembered thinking with a rare flicker of warmth that a palace with a child's laughter was a palace worth ruling. He knelt beside her. The matron gasped. Kaelin did not hear the gasp. The child opened her eyes. They were brown and wide and bright with fever. She saw him. She saw the crown. She did not know she should be afraid. She only lifted one small trembling hand toward his face, and she whispered, through lips that could barely shape the word, "Flower." He did not understand. He took her hand. It was cold. He had touched the hands of dying men on battlefields. He had never held a hand this small. Her fingers tightened once, then loosened, then stilled. The silver mist left her lips in a single slow breath and vanished into the air above her mouth. Her chest did not rise again. Kaelin did not move. He knelt there, holding the hand of a child he did not know. In a room he had never entered, in a palace he suddenly understood he had never truly ruled. Somewhere above him, the High Chancellor was already composing the decree that would seal the lower quarters and abandon these people to die. Kaelin's pride, the great iron architecture of it, the fortress he had built over 6 years of kingship, developed its first crack. He stood, he let the child's hand rest gently on her blanket. He turned, and he walked up the servant's stair without speaking, and the matron watched him go with tears streaming down her face, and a terrible trembling hope blooming in her chest. Kaelin rode alone. He had forbidden his guard to follow. He had forbidden the Chancellor to know. He had saddled his own horse in the pre-dawn dark, a great black stallion named Ash, and he had ridden out of the palace gates while the sky was still the color of wet iron. The guards at the gate had bowed without question. They had not seen their king ride out alone in 6 years. The blizzard had passed, but the forest remembered it. Snow lay thick and unbroken between the pines. The trees stood black against the white like columns of burned bone. Kaelin had not slept. He had spent the night in his war chamber, staring at a map of the kingdom, listening to the coughing of Doran in the next room. His second-in-command had passed the first hour of the morning. The silver mist had left his lips at dawn and had not returned. 73 dead. The number had been delivered to him by a trembling scribe an hour before he saddled Ash. 73 in the space of 8 days, 3 warriors, 2 handmaids, 68 of the serving class, a child who had called him Flower. He had not wept. He did not know how. His father had beaten the knowledge of tears out of him before his 10th birthday, but something inside him, something he had spent his entire reign refusing to name, was beginning to move. Something old, something his wolf had always known and his crown had always silenced. He pushed Ash harder than he should have. The stallion's breath came in great white plumes. The snow was deep, and each stride was a struggle, and Kaelin did not care. He had no map, he had no guide. He had only the memory of a woman walking through the great doors of the palace without looking back, and the slow, terrible certainty that his wolf had known, in that moment, what his king had refused to see. She had been his. The bond had sung the instant she stepped into the hall, and he had buried the song beneath the crown. He had buried it so deeply that he had not recognized it until 73 people were dead, and a child had whispered the word flower and closed her eyes forever. The forest grew thicker. The pines closed over him like a cathedral's vaulted ceiling. The light went green. The wind fell still. Ash slowed to a walk. Ears swiveling, nostrils flared at scents Kaelin could not catch. Somewhere deep in his chest, his wolf stirred. Not the controlled ceremonial wolf of the solstice processions. The other one, the true one. The one he had caged the night he tore a white veil from a woman's head. The wolf lifted its nose in the cage and it howled, silent and inward, and Kaelin felt the direction of the howl like a hand on his shoulder. North, northwest, past the great pine with a split trunk, up the ridge. He followed. He did not question. The cold made his eyes water, and he told himself it was the cold. His gloved hands ached on the reins. The bond, buried and mistreated and denied, was still somehow trying to lead him home. An hour passed, then another. The forest grew stranger. He began to notice things he could not explain. A patch of green moss on a stone untouched by snow. A cluster of small silver-edged leaves growing beneath a fallen log. Leaves he had seen drawn in the oldest texts of the royal library, leaves the court physicians had declared extinct. A bird, pale gold and impossibly alive in the dead of winter. that watched him from a low branch and did not flinch as he passed. He understood, without wanting to, that he was riding into a part of the world the court had lied about. The ridge rose before him. The pines thinned. Ash slowed further and then stopped entirely, his great head lowered, his sides heaving. Kalen dismounted. He tied the reins loosely to a sapling. He took 2 steps forward, and the snow beneath his boots gave way. He fell. The drop was not far, but it was sudden, and his shoulder struck a hidden root. Pain flared white behind his eyes. He lay on his back in the snow, staring up through the black lacework of pine boughs at a sky the color of bruised pearl, and he laughed once, a dry, broken sound. The king of Oakhaven, lord of 7 provinces, commander of 10,000 swords, lay in the snow beneath a tree, his shoulder aching, his horse unattended, his pride in pieces in a palace 80 miles behind him. He laughed because there was nothing else to do. He laughed because a child had called him flower. He laughed because he had spent 6 years building a fortress of pride, and one woman walking out of a hall had begun, without lifting a finger, to dismantle it. He tried to stand. His shoulder refused. He tried again and managed to push himself to his knees. Blood was seeping through his tunic where the root had torn it. He pressed a hand to the wound and looked up. She was standing above him on the ridge. He had not heard her approach. He did not know how long she had been there. She wore a gray wool cloak over a rough linen dress, and her white hair was loose down her back, and her silver scar was visible at the hollow of her throat where the cloak fell open. She held a wooden staff in one hand. She looked, he thought, with a strange calm, like something out of the oldest songs his mother had once hummed before his father forbade the singing. She looked at him for a long moment. She did not speak. She did not move to help him. And then, very quietly, she said, "You should not have come. You should not have come," she said again. Her voice was low and even, and it did not shake, the voice of a woman who had been silent for a long time and had learned at last exactly what her words were worth. Kalen stayed on his knees in the snow. He did not try to rise. Something in her face told him that rising would be the wrong movement, that a king on his feet was the one thing this woman would not receive. He lowered his head. The snow beneath him was cold. The cold was the least of it. "I know," he said. The wind moved through the pines above them. A small shower of snow drifted down between them like the fall of a distant curtain. Lyra did not lower her staff. Her knuckles were white on the wood. "You're bleeding," she observed. It was not an offer. It was a fact. Kalen pressed his hand harder against his shoulder. "Yes." "Good," she said. Then she turned and began to walk back up the ridge. Something tore in his chest. Not the wound. Something older. He pushed himself up from the snow with his good arm. His shoulder screamed. He bit down on the scream. He took 1 step after her, and then another, and the 3rd step brought him to the base of the ridge where she had stopped, her back still to him, her cloak stirring around her ankles. Lyra. He had never said her name aloud before, not once. In the great hall, he had called her the marked one. He had called her a blemish. He had not used her name because he had not allowed himself to know it. Now it came out of his mouth like a stone he had been carrying for a year. She turned. Her face was pale. Her eyes were the color of wood smoke. For the first time he saw, under the calm, the precise geography of what he had done to her. He saw the hollow under her eyes. He saw the scar on her collarbone that he had once helped expose to a jeering court. He saw that she had grown thinner. He saw that she had grown stronger. "Do not use my name," she said. "You forfeited the right the night you tore the veil." He bowed his head. He could not argue. He did not try. "The plague," he said. Her eyes narrowed very slightly. "So it has come then." She said it almost to herself. "They are dying?" He said. The words were difficult. "Dozens. Nearly 100. The physicians cannot touch it." A child called me flower, and then she stopped breathing. I do not know what flower meant, but I have not slept since. Something crossed Lyra's face, a flicker of a memory, a tightening at the corner of the mouth. She turned her face away toward the pines. She was quiet for a long while. Kalen did not interrupt the quiet. He had learned in the space of a morning that interrupting this woman was no longer a thing a wise man did. "She called you flower," Lyra said at last, "because I taught her that every kind person smells of lavender. I kept lavender in my pocket when I tended the kitchen children. She must have smelled it on you in your garden. She must have thought you were kind." Kalen closed his eyes. He felt the full and particular weight of not being kind. "Please," he said. The word was foreign in his mouth. He had never said it to anyone in his life. It came out rough and unshaped, an animal word he had not known his tongue could form. "Please, I'm not asking for myself. Come back with me. Whatever you ask, I will give. Land, Gold. A seat on the council. I will stand in the square and tell every lord who watched me throw you out what I did and why I was wrong. Just please. Lyra listened. She listened to every word, and when he was finished, she tilted her head slightly, and she said, "No." The word was soft. It was final. It did not tremble. "Go home, Kaelin of Oakhaven," she said. "Go home to your marble palace and your chancellor and your council of fearful old men. I swore on the night you exiled me that I would never heal a royal again. My mother died for healing a royal. I was 7 years old. I watched. I will not dishonor her by carrying a bucket of medicine through your gates." She turned again. She took 3 steps up the ridge. Kaelin sank back to his knees, not out of strategy, out of the simple collapse of a man who had run out of rooms inside himself. "Then let me die here," he said to her back. "I will not ride home. If you will not come, then the plague will take the rest. And I cannot stand in my war chamber and listen to one more child stop breathing." Lyra stopped, her shoulders stiffened. She did not turn. "Children," she said quietly. "The lower quarters are full of them," Kaelin said. "The Chancellor wants to seal the doors. I have not yet let him. If I die in this forest, he will seal them within the hour." A long silence, longer than any silence he had ever known. The forest held its breath. Somewhere a pale bird called once and was still. Lyra turned finally and looked at him kneeling in the snow. Her eyes had changed. The softness was not for him. It was for the children she had once carried lavender for. It was for a little girl named Flower. "I will come," she said. Her voice was very low. Her voice was very cold. "But not for you." She rode behind him on Ash, not touching him, her wooden staff across her lap, a leather satchel at her hip, packed tight with frost silver, winter lily bud, moonwort, and 3 small vials of a tincture she had brewed in a single night while Kaelin slept on the floor of her cottage beside the fire. She had not slept. She had worked. The herbs had whispered louder than they had ever whispered, as though they had been waiting a century for this hour. The palace gates opened without announcement. A single captain of the guard saw the king returning with a white-haired woman behind him, and the captain's mouth fell open. And then the captain, who had a nephew in the lower infirmary, dropped to one knee in the snow and did not rise until they had passed. Lyra did not look at the great doors of the hall. She did not look at the council chamber. She did not look at the throne. She rode straight past them, and when Ash came to the courtyard, she slid down from his back before Kaelin could offer her a hand. She did not need a hand. She had not needed a hand in many years. "Take me to the lower quarters," she said. The High Chancellor was already on the stairs. He had been waiting. Word travels quickly in a palace of frightened men, and the return of the king with the exiled witch on his horse had reached the council chamber before Ash had crossed the inner gate. The Chancellor's black cloak spilled down the steps behind him. His smile, the smile that never reached his eyes, had been carefully arranged. "Your Majesty," he said. His voice was silk stretched over steel. "You have brought a guest. I was not informed." "You were not meant to be," Kaelin said. He did not look at the Chancellor. He looked at Lyra. "Take her wherever she asks, open any door she requires. If she asks for a tool, find it. If she asks for a room, clear it. Anyone who obstructs her, obstructs me." The Chancellor's smile thinned. "Your Majesty, the council should be consulted before we permit an unlicensed healer, particularly one who has been, shall we say, previously removed from the palace grounds to attend to." "Consulted," Kaelin said, and for the first time since he had returned, something cold flickered back into his voice. "You will be consulted when I require a consultation. You have 2 choices, Chancellor. Stand aside, or follow me down to the infirmary and hold the hand of the next child who stops breathing. Choose." The Chancellor did not follow them. Lyra descended the servant's stair. Kaelin walked behind her. She had not asked him to. He walked because he could not make himself stop. At the door to the lower infirmary, she paused. She laid her palm flat against the wood. She closed her eyes. The silver scar at her throat glowed faintly, a thread of moonlight waking beneath her skin, though Kaelin could not see it beneath the collar of her cloak. She pushed the door open. The matron was inside. The matron who had dropped her cloth and knelt for a king 8 days before. The matron looked up and she saw the white hair and the silver scar and the hands that even now were unfastening a satchel of herbs, and the matron began silently to weep. Lyra went to the first mattress without a word, a boy of 11. Silver mist was already curling at his lips. She knelt. She did not ask permission from any lord. She pressed 2 fingers to the hollow of his throat. She took a frost silver leaf from her satchel and laid it on his tongue. She took a vial and poured 3 drops between his lips. She placed her palm on his chest. She closed her eyes and she whispered a word Kaelin could not hear. The silver mist stopped. It drew back. It faded. The boy coughed once, a small, rough cough, and then he drew a clean breath, a whole one. His small chest rose and rose again, and his eyelids fluttered, and he opened his eyes. The matron made a sound that was not quite a sob and not quite a laugh. Another servant, a woman older than the matron, pressed both hands to her mouth. Lyra moved to the next mattress. She did not pause. She did not celebrate. A younger girl with a deep cough, the same leaf, the same drops, the same whispered word, the same stillness, the same clean breath. She moved to the next, and the next, and the next. She healed the stable boys first, the kitchen children, the laundry women, the old gardener who had slipped lavender into her apron when she was 19 and had told her she had kind hands. She healed a blind man who wept because he could hear his own breath again for the first time in a week. She healed a pregnant undercook whose unborn child had been going silent in her womb. She healed them all before she ever set foot in the upper wards where the warriors and the minor nobles lay. Kalen watched. He did not interrupt. He did not speak. He stood in the doorway and he saw, with a clarity that cut him like a sharpened blade, the exact dimensions of the woman he had thrown into a blizzard. He saw a queen. He saw what a queen was supposed to be. He saw what his court had never, in all its marble and gold, produced. Lyra did not look at him once, not through any of it. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was only for the matron, and it said simply, "Bring me more hot water, and boil the linens. We are going to work through the night." He did not return to his chambers that night. He could not bear them. The great bed with its carved wolves at the headboard, the tall windows, the crimson banners, all of it belonged to a man he no longer recognized. He walked the upper corridors of the palace instead, slowly, alone. And when the moon rose high above the courtyard, he found himself in a small room at the end of the eastern wing that had once been his mother's sitting chamber. It had been locked for 18 years, since the day she died. He had ordered the lock changed and the key buried with her. The lock was still there. He broke it with his bare hand. The wood splintered. He pushed the door open and walked into the dust of his own forgotten childhood. The chamber smelled faintly of dried roses. His mother's embroidery still lay folded on a low table. A half-finished stitch. A small wolf running through a field of lavender waited for a hand that would never return. He did not sit. He could not. He walked to the window and pressed his forehead against the cold glass, and he let himself for the first time in his adult life. Remember? He remembered the hall, the winter solstice, the candles, the elder who had stepped forward to present Lyra with a trembling voice, saying, "She carries the old mark. My king, she carries the line we thought was lost." He remembered the chancellor's hand on his elbow, the whisper, "She will ruin you. She will unmake your dynasty. The lords will never kneel to a marked woman. Send her out or lose the north." He remembered his own hesitation, less than a breath. His wolf had risen inside him and pressed against his ribs and whispered her. And he had, with the full weight of a crown he had worn for 6 years, said no to his own blood. He had torn the veil. He had felt the silk given his hand. He had seen her white hair spill across her shoulders, and something deep inside him had howled with recognition, and he had silenced the howl with a single public sentence. A blemish on the sacred altar. A blemish? Kalen pressed both hands against the glass and lowered his head between them. His shoulders shook once. He did not make a sound. He had been taught very young that kings do not make sounds. But the glass fogged beneath his breath, and he watched the fog bloom and fade, and he understood that a king who could not weep was simply a man who had not yet learned how. His wolf rose in him again, not as a beast, as a grief. He felt it lay down somewhere inside his chest, slow and heavy, and he felt it mourn. She had healed 31 people today. He had been counting. 31 breaths returned to 31 bodies. She had not once looked at him. She had not once asked for bread or water for herself. The matron had brought her soup at midnight, and she had nodded and set it aside untouched. She had moved through the lower quarters like a candle moving through a long dark corridor, and where she passed, the dark receded. And he had understood, standing in the doorway, unable to enter, that he had tried to extinguish that candle in a blizzard. He walked to his mother's writing desk. He sat, he opened a drawer and found parchment still there, yellowed, waiting. He took up a quill. He dipped it. His hand shook. He had signed treaties with this hand. He had signed death warrants. He had signed the decree that had ordered the veil to be placed on Lyra's head. His hand had not shaken then. It shook now. He began to write. "Lyra," he wrote. Then he stopped. He crossed it out. He did not have the right. He started again. "Healer," he wrote. "I do not know how to say this. I have sat in rooms where 100 men waited for my word, and I knew every word. I do not know the words for tonight. I remember the hall. I remember every second of it. I have pretended for a year that I did not. I told myself that the chancellor pressed me, that the lords would not have accepted you, that the dynasty required firmness, that I was serving the kingdom. These are the things a coward says to keep sleeping. I knew you. The moment you stepped into the hall, I knew you. My wolf knew, my blood knew. Something in me that is older than any crown rose up and recognized its other half, and I silenced it because I was afraid of what the old men in black cloaks would think. I am the king of 7 provinces. I was afraid of old men in black cloaks. I watched a child die 8 days ago. She called me flower because you had taught her that kindness smells of lavender. She mistook my crown for kindness. I have never been kind. I have ruled. I have commanded. I have won. I have never once, in 6 years of kingship, been kind. Tonight, I watched you heal the stable boys first. Not the warriors, not the nobles, the stable boys, and I understood that I do not know how to be a king. I have been playing a king. You have been one your whole life, and I could not see it because I was looking for a crown on your head. I will not send this letter. You would have every right to burn it, but I needed to write the words somewhere. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. He signed it. Kalen, only Kalen, not the king. He folded the parchment. He placed it in his mother's embroidery basket, beneath the unfinished wolf running through lavender, where no one would ever find it. Then he lowered his head onto his mother's desk, and at last, silently, and for the first time, the king of Oakhaven wept. The workroom they gave her had once been a linen closet. Lyra had asked for it specifically. She did not want the grand apothecary with its gilded shelves and its crystal jars arranged by men who had never grown a plant. She wanted a small room, a stone floor, a single window, a hearth she could tend herself. The matron had cleared it within the hour. By the second night of her work in the palace, it had become the most important room in Oakhaven. A long wooden table ran down the middle. On it sat 3 mortars, 6 glass vials, a copper pot, a pair of iron shears, and a small pile of winter lily buds that had been brought to her that morning by a trembling undergardener who had found them, impossibly, growing in a sheltered corner of the royal arboretum. The arboretum had not produced a winter lily in 40 years. Lyra had accepted the buds without asking how, and the undergardener had bowed so low his forehead had touched the stone. She was grinding frost silver leaves in the mortar when the king came to the door. She did not look up. She had been expecting him. He had come every night for 6 nights, and every night she had not looked up, and every night he had not crossed the threshold. He stood in the doorway now, his shoulder bandaged beneath his tunic, his dark hair uncombed, his eyes the color of winter storms that had finally spent themselves. "May I?" he said. She continued grinding. The pestle made a soft, steady rhythm against the stone. "Bring the water," she said. He brought the water, a small copper kettle from the hearth, heavy in his hand. He set it on the table beside her. He did not sit. She had not offered a chair, and he had learned at last not to take what had not been offered. She poured a measured amount of the water into a glass vial. She tipped the ground frost silver into it. The liquid turned pale silver, and then impossibly paler still, as though the moon had bled into it. She stoppered the vial. She set it aside. She reached for a winter lily bud. The bud at her touch unfolded, not fully, only a little. A single white petal loosened and curled back as if recognizing a hand it had been waiting for. Kalen drew a slow breath. He had seen warriors bow. He had seen ambassadors kneel. He had never seen a flower open for a human being. "How many tonight?" he asked. 19, she said. 2 of the warriors, 7 of the stable hands, the rest are children. He nodded. He did not speak for a while. She did not fill the silence. She had learned that her silence was a tool sharper than any word. "The chancellor," he said finally, "has been petitioning the council." "I know," she said. "You do." "The kitchen girls hear everything," she said. "The kitchen girls tell me." He allowed himself, very carefully, a small and weary smile. It did not reach his eyes fully, but it reached them more than any expression that had crossed his face in a year. "You have built a court," he said quietly, "inside the one I built, and yours works." She did not answer. She crushed a second lily bud with the flat of her knife. The scent that rose from it was sharp and sweet and older than the palace itself. He watched her hands. They were small. They were scarred in places he had not noticed before. A long, thin line across the back of the left one. A burn at the base of the right thumb. He thought of the rings he had, 3 of them heavy and ceremonial, and he thought of how little those rings had ever done. "I wanted to ask you," he said, "about your mother." Her hands stilled, only for a heartbeat. Then they resumed. "Do not," she said, "not yet." "All right," he said. "All right." A long silence again. The copper pot over the hearth began to sing. She rose to tend it. He rose at the same moment, and his hand, reaching for the iron handle, brushed hers. Only for an instant, the back of his knuckles against the back of hers. A thing so small a court scribe would never record it. The silver scar at her throat warmed. She felt it. He did not see it, because her collar was high, but something in him felt it too, and his wolf rose in his chest and lowered itself again, slow and patient. The way a wolf lies down at the foot of a fire it is not allowed to approach. She pulled her hand away. He did not chase. He had learned too, not to chase. He stepped back and let her lift the pot alone. "Tell me something," he said, when she had poured the water and returned to the table. "Tell you what? Anything you choose." She considered. She chose. "I had a cat once," she said, "in the cottage where my mother lived. He was gray, and he had one white paw. He used to sit in the basket of drying chamomile, and he would sneeze every time he turned over. My mother used to laugh until she cried." It was the first thing she had told him about herself that was not a wound. Kalen closed his eyes for a moment. "Thank you," he said. She nodded, once without looking at him. She ladled the silver tincture into 19 small vials. She set them on a tray. She lifted the tray. "I have work," she said. "Yes," he said. He stepped aside from the door to let her pass. She passed without looking at him. She smelled, faintly, of lavender. He stood in the doorway of the linen closet that had become a workroom, and he listened to her footsteps move down the corridor, and he understood with a quiet and terrible joy that she had chosen tonight to tell him about a cat. It was more than he deserved. It was a beginning. The Chancellor had not slept well for 19 nights. His black cloak hung on its hook. His smile no longer arranged itself properly. Every morning, another report arrived on his desk, the lower quarters emptying of sickness. The infirmary beds filling with the recovered sitting up, eating broth, laughing, the matron walking through the corridors with the healer's name on her lips like a prayer, the stable boys telling the story of the white-haired woman to the grooms of visiting lords, the visiting lords carrying the story back to the north. 19 nights and the plague had receded almost entirely. 19 nights and a linen closet had become the beating heart of the palace. 19 nights and the Chancellor had not once been consulted by the king. He understood with the precise clarity of a man who has built his life on men's fears, that a court which no longer fears disease will soon remember how to ask questions, and questions in Oakhaven had always been his enemies. He summoned his 3 most loyal lords to the council chamber before dawn. Lord Marson of the Eastern Grainlands, a man whose debts the Chancellor held. Lord Perith of the Iron Mountains, a man whose bastard son the Chancellor had quietly kept alive. And old Lord Halvin, a man who still believed every white-haired woman was a witch because his grandfather had told him so. "Gentlemen," the Chancellor said with a smile that at last remembered how to reach his mouth, "we have a problem. The king has lost his judgment." Lord Marson stirred uneasily. "The healer has saved 89 lives, Chancellor." "She has saved 89 lives," the Chancellor agreed, "or she has caused them." The 3 lords looked at him. Outside, the dawn had not yet come. The torches guttered low. "Consider," the Chancellor said softly, "we had no plague before she came. We had no plague in 40 years. She is exiled in the winter solstice, and within days a sickness appears that defies all known medicine. The king rides alone into the forest to find her, and she alone possesses the cure. She refuses to come, and then agrees, and now walks our corridors as though she owns them. A child could follow the thread. My lords, a child could see the shape of the weaver." "You're suggesting," Lord Halvin whispered, "that she brewed it." "I'm suggesting," the Chancellor said, "that a woman with the mark of demons on her collarbone, exiled justly by our king under the advice of this council, has returned to finish what her mother began. I'm suggesting that every drop of her elixir is measured to keep this court dependent on her. I'm suggesting that she will ask within the fortnight for a seat at the king's right hand, and that our king, who has not been himself since her return, will grant it." Lord Perith's face darkened. "She would sit at the council." "She would replace the council," the Chancellor corrected gently. "She would replace us with her kitchen girls and her stable boys, because those are the people she has already gathered around herself. Have you walked the lower corridors, my lords? They speak her name as though she were a queen. A queen. A low-born exile with white hair." Lord Halvin crossed himself, old and trembling. "What do? We bring her in," the Chancellor said openly. Before the full court, we accuse her with evidence of brewing the plague herself. We have witnesses. We have a bottle found in her workroom that contains, unfortunately for her, the very mist the afflicted exhaled. We have a letter in her own hand. We have a serving girl who will testify that she saw the healer pour powder into the palace, well, a week before the first case. Do we have these things? Lord Marson asked carefully. We will have them, the Chancellor said by noon. Outside in the corridor, a kitchen girl named Wren, 16 years old, a girl whose mother had been saved by Lyra on the fourth night, stood very still against the wall with a basket of linens balanced on her hip. She had come to deliver towels to the council chamber at the Chancellor's order. She had arrived early. She had heard every word. She did not move. She did not breathe. She waited until the council chamber fell quiet, until she heard the Chancellor's chair scrape back, and then she slipped down the corridor on feet that had been trained to make no sound. She ran down the servants' stair, past the kitchens, through the garden passage, up the back stairs to the linen closet that had become a workroom. Lyra was grinding moonwort root. She looked up. Wren's face told her everything before Wren's mouth could. The girl whispered the story in 3 breaths. The bottle, the letter, the serving girl. The well, the noon. Lyra set down the pestle. Her hand did not tremble. Her silver scar warmed against her collarbone, steady and bright. She had known in some quiet chamber of her heart that this moment would come. The court had written a story about her the day she was born. The Chancellor had simply reached for the next page. She considered running, only for a single breath. The cottage on the ridge was waiting. The herbs would still whisper to her there. She could vanish into the pines before the noon bell. Then she thought of 19 children breathing clean air, of the matron who had dropped her cloth, of the blind man who wept when he heard his own breath, of a letter she suspected had been written and never sent, folded under an unfinished embroidery of a wolf in a field of lavender. She would not run, not this time. Tell the king, she said to Wren, quietly, alone. Tell no one else. Tell him to meet me in his mother's sitting chamber at the 11th bell. How did you, Wren whispered. How did you know about? Tell him, Lyra said gently, that the woman he threw away has decided to stay. The great hall at noon had not held so many lords since the winter solstice a year before. They had been summoned at dawn. They had come in their furs and their chains of office, and they had taken their places along the long marble hall beneath the banners of Oakhaven. The air smelled of cold stone and old incense. The torches burned high. A row of royal guards stood along each wall, helmets polished, spears upright, faces carefully blank. At the center of the hall, alone, stood Lyra. She wore no ceremonial white this time. She wore her own gray wool dress, her own leather satchel at her hip, her own silver scar bare at her throat where she had deliberately pulled back the collar. Her white hair was braided down her back. Her hands were at her sides. Her staff leaned, unused, against the base of the dais where she had set it down on entering. She did not look at the throne. She looked at the floor in front of her, the same floor where she had once been called a blemish. She was measuring the distance between the woman she had been then and the woman she was now, and she was finding the distance sufficient. The Chancellor stepped forward from the foot of the dais, his black cloak spread behind him like a stain. My lords, he said, his voice carried. He had practiced it. Today we uncover a treachery that has cost this kingdom 89 lives before its cure was even offered. Today we understand at last why the plague chose our court. Because it was brought here, by the hand of the very woman who now walks our corridors as though she were our queen. A murmur passed through the lords. Lyra did not move. Evidence, the Chancellor said. He lifted a small glass bottle. Found in her workroom this morning by my own men, contains the very silver mist the dying exhaled. A sample. My lords, a deliberate sample kept like a trophy. He lifted a folded letter. A letter in her hand addressed to an unknown recipient, outlining the progression of the sickness in chillingly accurate terms. He lifted a third item, a wooden ladle still dusted with a fine white powder, found hidden in the servants' well house. A serving girl, who will speak shortly, saw her there at midnight a fortnight before the first case. The Chancellor turned toward Lyra. His smile at last had found its full shape. Marked one, he said. His voice was soft, almost gentle, almost theatrical. Do you deny these charges? Lyra did not answer him. She did not look at him. She looked instead at the throne. Kalen sat there. His face was unreadable. His hands rested on the arms of the great carved chair. His dark eyes met hers and held. The Chancellor's smile thinned by the smallest degree. Marked one, he said again, a little louder. I ask you a direct question before this full assembly. Do you deny these charges?" The hall held its breath. Lyra turned her head slowly and looked at the chancellor for the first time. Her eyes were very calm. Her voice when it came was low and clear and did not tremble. "The bottle," she said, "is my own. I have used it for 6 nights to collect samples of the mist from the mouths of the dying so that I might understand the sickness well enough to cure it. Any healer would have done the same. Your own physicians would have done the same if they had thought to try." A ripple. The chancellor's smile did not move. "The letter," she said, "is a draft of instructions I wrote in my workroom for the matron of the lower infirmary, so that if I fell ill myself, another hand might continue the treatments. It is addressed to no one because I had not yet decided whom to trust." A second ripple. Louder. "The ladle," she said, "I have never seen. The well house I have never entered. The serving girl, whoever she is, has been paid or frightened, and I will forgive her, because a girl does not betray a stranger in this palace unless a man in a black cloak has stood over her first." The ripple became a murmur. The murmur became a shifting of bodies. Old Lord Halvin crossed himself. Lord Marson looked for the first time at the Chancellor's face rather than his cloak. The Chancellor raised his hand. A signal. A captain of the guard stepped forward at the Chancellor's prearranged command and seized Lyra by the elbow. A second guard stepped forward and snapped iron shackles around her wrists. The clang of the shackles rang through the hall. Kaelin's hands tightened on the arms of the throne. His knuckles went white. His jaw flexed once. "My lords," the Chancellor said, sweeping his arm out, a confession, as we can all hear, shaped like a denial. She admits the bottle. She admits the letter. She blames others for the ladle, as all guilty women do. "I call for immediate sentence. By the old law, a witch who brings plague to the royal court is to be put to the blade before sundown." "Before the sun, what?" The voice had come from Kaelin. It was very soft. The whole hall heard it. The Chancellor bowed. "Your Majesty, the old law is clear." "The old law," Kaelin said still softly, "was written by men who could not heal a child." He stood. The captain of the guard, without thinking, had already drawn his sword. He had been given a prior instruction. He had been told in a dim corridor at the 10th bell that if the healer resisted or if the king hesitated, the sentence was to be carried out at once on the floor of the hall before any sentimental royal voice could interfere. The captain's blade rose. The sun, through the high windows, caught the edge of the blade and turned it to a line of white fire. Callan moved. He was already moving before anyone saw him move. The blade began to fall. The hall fell silent as a tomb. Kaelin's hand closed around the captain's wrist the instant before the blade touched her. Bone met bone. The captain's arm stopped as though it had struck stone. The sword trembled in the air above Lyra's shoulder, a finger's width from her white hair. The whole hall saw it. The whole hall breathed again. Kaelin did not raise his voice. "Drop the sword," he said. The captain dropped it. The sword struck the marble with a long ringing note that traveled the length of the hall. Kaelin reached down without looking and unlocked the shackles at Lyra's wrist with the small iron key at his belt. The shackles fell. They too struck the marble. The sound was smaller than the sword, but it carried further. He turned to the Chancellor. He did not draw his own blade. He did not need to. "You will stand," Kaelin said, where she stood a moment ago. The Chancellor opened his mouth. Kaelin raised one finger. The Chancellor closed it. "Guards," Kaelin said. The guards along the walls shifted, every man of them, and not one of them looked at the Chancellor. "Take the Chancellor into custody. He will answer under oath before this court for the ladle that appeared in a well house he alone controls, and for the serving girl who was seen at his door this morning, and for a great many older things besides." The Chancellor's face did not move. He had built his life on men's fears, and the fear in the hall had at last changed directions. 2 guards took him by the elbows. He walked between them without resisting. He knew, as well as anyone in Oakhaven, when the current had turned. Kaelin turned back to Lyra. For the first time since the morning he had torn her veil, he looked at her, fully, in front of the full court. His voice when he spoke was not the voice of a king. It was the voice of a man. "There's still work," he said. She nodded. "There's still work." The last pocket of the plague, the most stubborn one, lived in the sealed eastern ward. 7 patients, a stable boy named Tam, a child she had known by sight for 3 years, a cook's daughter of 10, 4 warriors who had been the last to fall, and old Lord Halvin's grandson, a young man of 17, who had collapsed at dawn while riding to the hall. The silver mist in them had not receded. Her ordinary elixirs had touched them and then slipped off as though the sickness in them had sunk to some deeper place no tincture could reach. She had known since the third night what the final cure required. She had not spoken of it. Not even to the king. The moonbound ritual, a rite her mother had described only once in a half-dreamed whisper on a summer evening when Lyra was 6. A rite that required the full moon, a rite that required the silver scar, unwrapped open to the sky, a rite that drew the healing not from herbs alone, but from the lineage itself, from the long line of white-haired women who had walked the pine forest before any king of Oakhaven had lifted a sword, a rite that burned through the healer even as it saved others, a rite her mother had called, very quietly, the price the world does not deserve to ask of us. The moon that night would be full. She had checked. The herbs had told her a week ago. She asked for the courtyard. The small northern courtyard, open to the sky, bordered by the arboretum where the winter lilies had impossibly bloomed. She asked for the 7 patients to be brought on their pallets. She asked for the court to stay away. She asked for the matron and Wren and 3 of the older kitchen women who had fed her in silence for 10 years. She asked for Kalen to stand at the edge, and only at the edge and under no circumstance to cross the circle she would draw. He agreed to all of it without speaking. The sun set. The 7 pallets were arranged in a crescent on the frostbright stones. The moon rose above the black pines of the distant ridge, enormous, white, watchful. Lyra unbraided her hair. She let it fall down her back like a river of moonlight. She loosened the collar of her dress and bared the silver scar at her collarbone. The scar had begun already to glow. She drew the circle with a stick of charred winter lily, a wide ring of soft black around the 7 patients. She stepped inside. She knelt at the center. She placed her palms flat against the cold stone. She closed her eyes. She whispered 3 words in a language she had not known. She remembered. The language her mother had hummed into her hair in infancy. The silver scar flared, not a glow now. A light, a true, clean, moonlit light that rose from her collarbone in a thin pillar and spread slowly outward across the 7 sleeping bodies. The air in the courtyard grew very still. The matron fell to her knees. Wren pressed both hands to her mouth. Kalen, at the edge of the circle, did not kneel. He stood and he watched, and his wolf inside him lowered itself to the stone in reverence. The silver mist in the 7 patients began to rise, not toward the sky, as it had in the dying, toward Lyra, toward her scar. The mist drifted across the circle like 7 small tides drawn to one moon. She drew a breath. She drew them in. The mist came to her gently at first. 7 pale streams, each the color of the moon through thin cloud, drifting across the stones of the courtyard and finding the silver scar at her throat. The scar drank them. Lyra felt each stream enter her as a cold, soft pressure, like 7 cool hands pressed against her collarbone, each one asking permission, each one being given. Then the first stream reached the deep place inside her where the sickness truly lived, and the cold became fire. She gasped, her back arched. The matron cried out and started forward, and Kalen caught the matron by the shoulder and held her, gently but firmly at the edge of the circle. "Do not cross," he said. His voice was low. "She told us not to cross." Lyra did not scream. She had promised herself long ago, on a winter night at the age of 7, that she would never scream the way her mother had not screamed. She bit down on the inside of her cheek and she tasted blood, and she kept breathing. The mist kept coming. 1 stream, then 2, then 4, then all 7 at once, pouring into her scar in a rushing current of illness that wanted, very badly, to kill her. Her white hair lifted around her head as though a wind had found her. There was no wind. The courtyard was still. The lift of her hair came from inside, from the line of women before her. Generation upon generation of moonbound healers reaching through the bond of blood to hold her up. She felt them. She felt her mother among them, somewhere near, a warm small presence at her left shoulder. She felt older ones she had never known, their hands ghostly and certain under her ribs, holding her lungs open while the sickness tried to close them. The silver scar at her throat blazed. It became a small sun. The light spread down her arms, along her spine, out to the tips of her fingers where it pooled briefly and then sank back. Her skin, for a long moment, was no longer skin. It was a lantern. The moonlight above her bent down and met the light coming out of her, and the 2 became one, and the stones of the courtyard glowed faintly silver, as though remembering a song they had not sung in 100 years. The 7 patients on their pallets began to breathe, not the shallow, rattling breath of the dying. Full breath, whole breath. The stable boy Tam coughed once, a small clean cough, and turned his face toward the moon in his sleep and smiled. The cook's daughter let out a long sigh. The 4 warriors breathed together, as though commanded. Old Lord Halvin's grandson, on the seventh pallet, opened his eyes briefly, saw the white-haired woman glowing at the center of the circle, and whispered a single word before falling into true healing sleep. Mother. He had not known his mother. His mother had died at his birth. He said the word as though he had at last met her. Lyra did not hear him. She was somewhere else now. She was walking in her mind along a long path of silver that stretched back through winters she had never lived. She saw her mother on the path, hands held out, not weeping, not burning, whole. She saw a grandmother she had never known, dark-eyed and laughing, with the same silver scar. She saw a woman so old she was almost translucent, standing at the far end of the path, who inclined her head to Lyra with a gravity that was older than Oakhaven itself. The oldest woman said, with a voice like wind through winter reeds, "You're the one who stayed." "I am," Lyra answered. "Then rise," the old woman said. "You have work that is not done." The silver light in the courtyard flared once, brilliantly, and then folded inward. The mist was gone. The sickness was gone. The moonlight returned to its proper place in the sky. The stones dimmed. The wind, at last, stirred the pines beyond the arboretum as though the world had been holding its breath and could now release it. Lyra swayed on her knees. Her hair fell back around her shoulders. The silver scar at her throat returned to its quiet glow, smaller now, steady, the way a candle is steady after a storm. She tried to stand. Her body, which had held 100 generations of women for the length of a single rite, had nothing left. She fell forward. Kalen crossed the circle in 3 strides. He did not hesitate. He caught her before her face could touch the stones. He went to one knee and he pulled her against his chest, and he held her there as carefully as a man holds the only thing he has ever been afraid of losing. The matron came next, weeping openly, her cloth forgotten. Wren followed, and the 3 kitchen women, and they formed a small, close ring around the 2 of them on the cold stones of the courtyard, and not one of them spoke. Lyra's eyelids fluttered. She looked up. Her face was very pale. Her silver scar pulsed soft and alive. "The 7, she whispered. "Breathing?" Kalen said. "All of them? You saved them." She smiled. It was a very small smile. It was the first smile she had given him. Then she let her head rest, for the first time in her life, against the shoulder of a king. And she closed her eyes, and she did not die. She slept. And Kalen, holding her, felt the steady living weight of her breath against his collarbone, and understood at last what his wolf had tried to tell him in a hall full of candles a year ago. 3 days. That was all she took. 3 days of sleeping under the high window of the king's mother's sitting chamber, the room Kalen had quietly opened and aired and filled with lavender from the arboretum, a room she had not asked for but had not refused. On the morning of the 4th day, she woke at dawn, rose, dressed herself in gray wool, braided her white hair down her back, and walked alone to the great hall. The court had been summoned, every lord, every lady, every captain of the guard, every servant who could be spared from duty, because Lyra had asked through Wren that the servants be allowed to stand along the walls. Kalen had agreed without argument. The servants stood now, 3 and 4 deep, behind the rows of nobles. The matron was there. The blind man was there, his hand on the shoulder of the stable boy Tam. Old Lord Halvin's grandson stood near the front, alive, upright, his eyes fixed on the doors. The chancellor was brought in chains. He walked between 2 guards. His black cloak had been taken from him. He wore a plain gray tunic. His smile was gone. His shoulders were gone. He was, at last, only a narrow old man who had spent his life in black cloth, and without the cloth he looked smaller than any of the servants along the wall. Lyra entered through the southern doors. She did not walk to the center of the hall this time. She walked to the dais. Kalen rose from the throne as she approached, and he stepped down from the dais, and he stood beside it, not above her, not before her, but beside. He did not offer her his hand. He had learned at last that she had never needed one. She turned to face the hall. Her silver scar was bare at her throat. She let it show. She let it glow, faintly, for anyone with eyes to see. "I'm Lyra," she said. Her voice carried. The hall was silent. Daughter of Aelin of the Northern Pines. Granddaughter of Mera of the Winter Valleys. Great-granddaughter of a line this court has tried for 100 years to forget. I'm a moonbound healer. I'm the last of my kind in this kingdom, because your fathers and your grandfathers burned the others. A murmur moved through the hall. She let it move. She did not hurry. "You have questions," she said. "I will answer 2 of them now. The rest you may ask in time, because time, for the first time in my life, is something I have." The first question, did I bring the plague? No, the plague was not brewed. The plague was old. It has lived in the deep wells of Oakhaven for 60 years, since the last moonbound healer was burned, and there was no one left to hear the sickness in the water. Healers are not only menders of wounds, my lords. We hear the wells. We hear the roots. We hear what the land tries to say. When you silenced us, you silenced your own ears. The plague came because you had no one left to listen. Another murmur, deeper, ashamed. The second question, she said, is about the man in chains. She did not point. She did not need to. Every eye in the hall had already found the chancellor. 16 years ago, Lyra said, in a village called Dorn Hollow at the edge of the northern pines, a woman healed a royal prince of a fever that had defeated every physician. Her name was Aelin. She was 31 years old. She had a 7-year-old daughter. When she returned home from the palace, 3 days later, a rider came. The rider brought soldiers. The rider brought a decree sealed with this kingdom's crest. The rider brought a pyre. The hall had gone very still. Old Lord Halvin had begun, silently, to weep. My mother was tied to a post of green pine, Lyra said. Her voice did not rise. It did not need to. The whole hall was bending toward her. They made me watch. I was 7. The man who held my shoulders was a soldier who was kind enough not to cover my eyes because he wanted me to remember. I have remembered. She turned her head slowly and she looked at the chancellor. The man who brought the decree, she said, was you. The chancellor did not answer. He did not lift his head. The prince you saved, Lyra said, did not even know his mother had been burned in his name. The court did not tell him. The court did not tell the king. The court did not tell anyone. Because a moonbound healer on record would have forced this kingdom to remember what it had done to the others. And the chancellor had spent 40 years making the others forgotten. She looked past the chancellor at the full length of the hall. I came here, she said, as a girl of 14. I worked in your kitchens. I healed your children in silence. I was invisible to you. And I chose that invisibility because my mother had taught me that silence was a shield. She was wrong. Silence is not a shield. Silence is a grave I dug for myself every morning for 10 years. I'm done digging it. She drew a slow breath. The silver scar at her throat pulsed once, bright and steady. I name the chancellor, she said, by the law of this kingdom, and by the witness of every person in this hall, as the murderer of my mother, the architect of the plague that killed 89 of your kin, and the liar who has stood at the shoulder of your kings for 40 years. Let him answer, not to me, to them. She swept her hand slowly across the servants along the walls. The matrons stepped forward. Then Wren, then the blind man, then the stable boys, then at last old Lord Halvin, trembling on his cane, crossed the floor to stand with them. The chancellor, who had built his life on men's fears, looked at last into the faces of the people he had been certain would always kneel, and he understood that the current of Oakhaven had turned and would not be turning back. He lowered his head. He did not speak. He did not need to. The trial lasted 4 days. The chancellor was stripped of his title, his lands, and his name, and sent under guard to the northern stone keep, where he would live out the remainder of his years in a small cell with a small window that looked out upon the pines. Lyra had asked that he not be executed. The matron had wept at the mercy. Lord Halvin had wept at it too. Lyra had only said quietly that her mother's death had been enough fire for one lifetime, and she would not answer it with more. The lords who had sat in his chamber at dawn, the ones he had gathered to bring her down, came one by one to the workroom that had once been a linen closet, and each of them knelt on the stone floor, and each of them asked her, not for pardon, but for instruction. She told them to rise. She told them the pardon was not hers to give. She told them to go, instead, to the matron, and to the blind man, and to Wren, and to ask those 3 whether they wished to sit on the new council Oakhaven was about to build. Each of the lords, pale and quiet, did exactly as she said. On the 7th morning, Kaelin came to the courtyard where the winter lilies grew. She was kneeling among them, pulling a few late weeds with her bare fingers. The scar at her throat was quiet today, warm and ordinary. She had not slept well. She had dreamed again of her mother, but this time her mother had been laughing. He did not speak for a while. He only stood at the edge of the lily beds and watched her work. He had brought nothing with him, no crown, no retinue, no ceremony. Lyra, he said at last. She looked up. The morning sun lit the ends of her white hair. I have something to ask you, he said, and I want you to hear it as a question, not a command. I have had enough in my life of men who could not tell the difference. She sat back on her heels. She waited. This kingdom, he said, does not deserve you. I do not deserve you. I'm aware of both of those facts, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise, but the kingdom needs you. The people in that hall yesterday, and the servants along the walls, and the matron and Tam and 100 other people whose names I'm only beginning to learn. They need you, not as a healer in a closet. As a queen. He paused. His throat worked. I'm not asking you to marry me, he said. Not today. Not for a long while, if ever. Whether you and I are ever a he and a she in the way my wolf first knew. That is a question for years, not for weeks, and it is yours to answer when you're ready. If you're ever ready, and I will accept whatever answer you give, what I'm asking is different. He lowered himself slowly to one knee among the winter lilies. Not a deep bow, not a performance, a careful, plain kneeling of the kind a man does when he is not sure his legs will hold him otherwise. Rule with me, he said, not under me. With me. Take the crown as your own, not as mine given. Sit on the throne at equal height. Write the laws, rewrite the ones I signed that should never have been signed. Dismiss the council that cannot serve you. Build the council that can. I will not overrule you. I will ask your counsel before I speak in any hall. I will defer to you in any matter of the people, because you know them, and I, until 4 weeks ago, did not. He drew a slow breath. This is not a gift. A gift can be taken back. This is a vow spoken in front of the one witness who matters, which is you. I would like to say it before the full court in a ceremony, if you will allow me. But if you would rather it be only spoken here, among the lilies, with no one to hear it but the flowers, then here among the lilies it will remain, and I will still keep every word. Lyra did not answer at once. She set down the small weed she had been holding. She rose slowly to her feet. She walked toward him across the lily bed. Her bare feet made no sound on the cold earth. She stopped in front of him. She looked down at him for a long, quiet moment. Her silver scar pulsed once. Stand up, she said. He stood. She reached out and placed her palm flat against his chest over the place where the wolf lived. She felt the beat of his heart through his tunic, steady, slow, nervous. I will accept, she said, on 3 conditions. Name them. 1, I do not wear a crown that calls me queen consort. I will be Queen Lyra, in my own name, in my own right, and any lord who bows to you must also bow to me, or not set foot in our hall. Agreed, he said at once. 2, the first act of our joined reign will be the repeal of the Mark Law, which has declared the scars of my lineage cursed for 100 years. I will write the repeal myself. You will sign it without revision. It will be read in every village square in Oakhaven before the first snow falls again. He did not hesitate. Agreed. And 3, she said, her voice softened only slightly. My mother's name, Aelin of Dorn Hollow. It will be carved above the door of the healing house I'm going to build, and spoken in full, in the public record, as the first moonbound healer honored by this court. You will speak it aloud in the hall yourself. Kaelin's eyes went bright. He nodded once slowly. I will speak it, he said, until my voice gives out. She took her hand from his chest. She stepped back. The winter lilies stirred around her ankles in a wind that had not been there a moment before, and he saw for the briefest instant the shapes of 100 white-haired women standing among the flowers, and then only Lyra. Then, yes, she said, I will rule. She was crowned on the first day of spring, not in the great hall where she had been shamed. Though that hall had been cleaned and its banners taken down, she had asked instead for the northern courtyard where she had performed the moonbound ritual, the place where stones still remembered her light. The court had protested. The court had been overruled. Oakhaven was by then learning the particular music of being overruled by its queen. There was no veil. She had forbidden the veil. She wore a simple gown of undyed linen with a collar cut low to show the silver scar at her throat, and her white hair was loose down her back, and her feet were bare against the sun-warmed stones. Kaelin stood beside her, not behind, not in front, and he held the crown in both hands and waited for her nod before he placed it on her head. The crown was new. She had designed it. A thin circlet of silver braided to look like winter lily stems with a single small moonstone at the brow. No gold, no rubies. The old crown of queens, heavy with 6 generations of stones, had been melted and sold to fund the first healing house. The circlet settled on her white hair. Kaelin stepped back. Lyra turned to face the crowd. She did not call them lords and ladies. She did not call them subjects. She called them people of Oakhaven, and the servants along the arboretum wall wept, because no ruler of this kingdom had ever called them people in the same breath as the nobles. And they understood, hearing it, that the wall had fallen. She signed the repeal of the Mark Law that afternoon. She had written it with her own hand, in a single clear paragraph on a single sheet of parchment. No scribe had touched it. Any person born in Oakhaven with a scar, a mark, a coloring, or a feature that superstition had declared cursed from this day forward and forever, was to be held equal under the law, free to hold property, to testify in court, to marry, to inherit, to teach, and to serve at any rank, including the throne. Kaelin signed it beneath her name in ink a shade darker than hers, so that anyone reading the parchment in later centuries would know whose pen had come first. By the second month of her reign, the Academy of the Verdant site had broken ground. She built it on the land where the old council chamber had stood. She had the council chamber demolished herself, swinging the first hammer at the western wall, in a gown of gray wool and her bare feet wrapped in cloth, and the kitchen girls had cheered her from the scaffolding. The new building rose in its place over the summer. It had wide windows. It had a long, low hall for lectures. It had a garden that wrapped entirely around the building on all four sides, and in the garden grew every herb Lyra had ever whispered to, and many she was only beginning to learn. She taught the first classes herself. Her first students were 7 girls and 2 boys, none of them nobles, all of them children of the lower quarters, and among them was Tam the stable boy and Wren the kitchen girl. And 2 children with silver scars of their own who had been hidden in cellars by frightened mothers for the whole of their short lives. The mothers had come, shaking in the 3rd week, to beg Lyra's pardon for the hiding. Lyra had held them both and told them the pardon was not hers. It was their daughters, and their daughters had forgiven them the instant the daughters had seen the queen's own scar bare at her throat. The new council was seated in the autumn, 12 chairs, 6 of noble birth, 6 of the people. Lord Halvin sat among the nobles, old and trembling and unfailingly present. The matron sat among the people, her cloth traded for an official seal. Wren sat among the people, the youngest member ever seated at a council of Oakhaven, and she held her own in debate from the first afternoon. The blind stable hand was offered a chair and declined with a smile, saying he preferred to keep the horses who lied less than lords. He was given by the Queen's own decree a small pension and a cottage beside the Arboretum, and he accepted that. By the 2nd year, the plague was gone from Oakhaven, fully. The wells had been redug under Lyra's direction, following the old whispered methods of the moonbound line, and the land had been taught, slowly, to speak again. Healers trained at the academy walked the villages. Each one carried a small vial of frost silver tincture, and each one had been taught to listen to the wells before they prescribed any cure. By the 3rd year, the northern provinces, which had once threatened to withdraw their oaths, sent delegations asking whether their own daughters might study at the academy. Lyra accepted them all. Everyone. She asked no fee but 1 small jar of local honey and a written account of the province's oldest healing song, so that the academy's library might begin to remember what the kingdom had tried to forget. By the 5th year, a statue had been raised in the market square of Dorn Hollow, a tall woman of stone, white where the stone caught the light, a silver scar carved at her throat. The plaque beneath bore only 4 words, chosen by Lyra herself after long thought. Aelin. Who was right? Callan came to the village alone on the 5th anniversary and knelt at the base of the statue and stayed a long time. He said nothing. He did not need to. He had spoken her name by then, so many times in the hall that the name had worn itself smooth in his mouth, and the saying of it no longer required effort. It required only memory. He had enough. 10 years after the night of the moonbound ritual, the Arboretum of Oakhaven had become a garden known throughout 3 kingdoms. It was no longer walled off. The high hedges had been taken down in the 2nd year. Any person who wished to walk among the winter lilies was welcome, at any hour in any season. There was no gate, there was no guard, a small wooden sign at the southern entrance carved by the blind stable hand in his last winter of life. Read only, all who breathe may enter, and many did. On a bright morning in early spring, a woman with white hair and a silver circlet walked along the central path of the garden. She was barefoot. She had been barefoot in every season for nearly a decade, a habit the court had at first resisted, and then with time come to find beautiful. Her hair had a single streak of silver at the temple now, where the ritual had marked her, and it caught the sun as she walked. She carried a small basket. In the basket were 6 lily buds, carefully cut, destined for a healing house in the far eastern province, where a child had been born the night before with a silver scar, exactly like her own. 2 children ran ahead of her along the path. The older was a girl of 7. Her hair was dark, like her father's, but she had been born with a small pale mark, a half moon at the base of her throat. She had laughed at her first sight of it in a mirror, and she had never been afraid of it, because no one in Oakhaven was afraid of such marks anymore. Her name was Aelin. Lyra had chosen the name. Kaelin had wept when she told him. The younger was a boy of 4. His hair was white as his mother's. His eyes were the color of winter storms, his father's eyes exactly, and he had a way of standing very still and watching the herbs as though they were speaking to him, because they were. His name was Doran, after a second in command who had died before his time of a silver mist. Kaelin had asked for the name. Lyra had agreed. The two children were chasing a small brown butterfly between the lily beds, laughing in the clear, unself-conscious way of children who have never once been told to be quiet. Lyra watched them. She felt the particular peace of a mother who has raised her children in a world she herself has made safer. It was not a peace her own mother had been given. It was a peace her own mother had died to build. She did not take a single moment of it for granted. Kaelin came down the path from the direction of the academy. He was dressed simply, as he had dressed for 10 years now, a plain tunic and a dark cloak. The heavy ceremonial robes stayed in a cedar chest in the eastern wing, brought out only for state functions, which were fewer each year. His hair had gone silver at the temples, like hers, though from a different cause, and it suited him. He was a kinder-looking man than he had been. He had earned the kindness. He came to her side. He did not touch her. He had learned long ago to wait for her hand. She reached out and she laced her fingers with his, and they stood together among the winter lilies, watching their two children chase a butterfly that had no idea of the history it was flying through. The academy, he said, has accepted 42 new students this year from 9 provinces. Good, she said. 3 of them, he said, are boys with silver scars. She smiled. Better. He turned his face toward her. Lyra, he said. Yes. Thank you. She looked at him. She understood what he meant. She understood he had said it before, in many forms, over 10 years, and that he would say it again, in many more, over however many years they were given. She squeezed his hand once gently, and she said, "You're welcome." And she did not add any of the softer words she had long since forgiven him for having needed to earn. The forgiving was finished. What was left was living. Aelin came running back along the path with the butterfly perched on her small finger. "Mother," she called. "Mother, look." She came to my hand on her own. I didn't chase her. She just came. Little Doran came behind her, breathless and laughing, his white hair sticking up in every direction. Lyra knelt on the path and let her daughter show her the butterfly. The butterfly stayed a long moment, wings slowly opening and closing, then lifted and circled once around Lyra's head as though bowing, and drifted away toward the eastern beds. Aelin watched her go. She said very seriously, "I think she knew you, Mother." "I think she did," Lyra said. She stood. She looked at her son, at her daughter, at the man beside her, whose hand was still in hers. She looked beyond them at the long lines of lilies, at the academy rising white in the distance, at the statue of her mother visible on the hill above the garden, at the kingdom that had at last learned to listen. She spoke quietly to her daughter. "Little one," she said, "someday you will be old and you will tell the children of your children a story. Tell them this. Tell them that a girl with white hair was thrown into a blizzard and she did not die and she did not harden and she came back with her hands full of medicine. Tell them that a king knelt in the snow and said, 'Please,' and he meant it. Tell them that voices which were silenced for 100 years were given back their singing. Tell them that the cruelest winter can still bloom a lily. Tell them, most of all, that the mark they fear in a little girl may be the last mercy their kingdom ever receives." Aelin nodded, solemn. Doran nodded beside her because his sister had. Kaelin squeezed his wife's hand. Lyra looked up at the spring sky above Oakhaven and breathed, and the silver scar at her throat glowed faintly with a light that had been burning in one form or another for 1,000 winters, and would keep burning, she knew now, for 1,000 more. Her story has come to an end, but our journey together continues. If you found this story inspiring and meaningful, please like the video to support me. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next empowering stories. And if you have any thoughts about the characters, her journey, or want to share your own story, please comment below. I really look forward to reading and chatting with you. Disclaimer: this video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, settings, and events depicted are entirely imaginary and are not intended to represent real-life people or situations. Please view for entertainment purposes only.